everyone, my name is Jessie Creamean and I'm a research scientist at the Colorado State University. I am on MOSAiC because I am a funded PI to look at aerosol cloud interaction measurements throughout the entire year. And right now I am on the academic Fedorov icebreaker. We are at about 85 degrees north, just a little bit north of that. And we're awaiting the arrival of the polar stern to find an ice floe to set up the entire network on. And so today I'll be talking a little bit about aerosols and how they affect clouds and precipitation in the atmosphere, and also why they're important in the Arctic. And so basically, an aerosol particle, what is one? So an aerosol is essentially a liquid or a solid that's suspended in a gas. And so in this case, we have the atmosphere, that's the gas. There are aerosols that come from natural sources. So we have sea spray, mineral dust. There are vegetation that emit aerosols into the atmosphere. And then we also have anthropogenic aerosols, so things that come from traffic, from combustion sources, from agriculture. Those are things that humans produce. So in order for an aerosol that originates as a particle on the ground, essentially, to become airborne, you need wind in the equation. And so things like desert dust, sea spray coming from the ocean surface, soot coming from trucks, and then also gases emitted from these different sources like trees and agriculture and cars. Those can be emitted to the atmosphere and undergo reactions where they can become aerosol particles. And so these things get emitted into the atmosphere by winds, and then they can get carried thousands of kilometers up into the atmosphere. Aerosols are important once they enter the atmosphere because they can have effects on the radiation budget. And so certain types of aerosols in the atmosphere, like sea salt, basically act like little mirrors, and they can actually reflect solar radiation back into space. If you have other aerosol types like soot coming from trucks, those things tend to absorb energy in the atmosphere, causing it to heat up. Now, if you have aerosol particles of different compositions and size, they can actually act as seeds for cloud formation. So you can think of a cloud like a plant. It basically needs seeds to grow. And so these types of aerosols are called either cloud condensation nuclei, or CCN, or ice nucleating particles, or INPs, forming either liquid droplets or ice crystals in a cloud. And so these clouds that these aerosols form can then either scatter radiation back to space, or they can actually act like a blanket in the atmosphere and trap energy and heat into the Earth's atmosphere. Aerosols, once they're in clouds, they don't only affect the solar radiation and thermal radiation in the Earth's atmosphere. They can also affect how clouds precipitate. And so let's say we have a pollution plume and you have a cloud formed from all these little pollution particles. So what happens is you have a lot of these little droplets that are competing for any available water vapor, and that tends to inhibit precipitation coming from a cloud because they take longer to grow into precipitation-sized droplets. Now, on the other hand, if you have ice nucleating particles in a cloud like mineral dust or bacteria, those things form these really large ice crystals that can grow faster into precipitation. And so what's typically thought is that under a lot of conditions that ice nucleating particles, or INPs, can actually cause clouds to rain or snow out. So this effect is inherently dependent on the number of them, their chemistry, and also their size. And so specific to the Arctic, these effects are really important, namely aerosol effects on clouds, because they can have a role in Arctic amplification. And so basically, as the Arctic is getting warmer year to year, we have these compounding effects that's causing it to accelerate in its heating. And so, for example, when we have the sea ice thawing out, you have darker ocean surface that's being exposed that can absorb more heat and energy. And so that contributes to additional warming. And we also have permafrost that's thawing. And so as the soil that's remained frozen for thousands of years is thawing out, these reserves of greenhouse gases are being emitted into the atmosphere. And so that's causing an additional warming as well. And so as a result, the Arctic is warming at least twice as fast as the rest of the globe. And it's affecting air and circulation patterns all over the world, not just in the Arctic. And so my question is specifically, how are aerosols and clouds playing a role in this process? And so aerosols have effects on the radiation budget, precipitation, cloud lifetime, cloud radiative forcing, but it's also really important for energy reaching the sea ice surface. You can see a lot of clouds in the atmosphere today that might be acting to trap heat in or reflect solar radiation away from the sea ice surface. And so aerosols, again, play a big role in this. And so a lot of previous work has gone into trying to characterize Arctic aerosol. And generally what we found is that in the winter and the spring, we have transport of pollution coming up from mid-latitudes. And so this is known as the Arctic haze season. And basically we have a lot of aerosols coming up into the Arctic. However, in the summer, we tend to see this transport start to die off, and then we also have more precipitation that's removing these aerosols from the atmosphere that are making their way up there. And so the Arctic kind of resumes to a more pristine or clean conditions where we have local aerosol production from things like ocean biology and vegetation. And so although we have a pretty good grasp on the annual cycle of aerosols, there's still a lot of remaining uncertainties associated with not only the observations, but especially modeling the aerosols and how they affect clouds and radiation. And so specifically for the biology, that is a really important thing in the Arctic in terms of aerosols. However, there's not a lot of work that's been done on it. So that's why people like me are here to try to understand it a little better. So how does biology in the Arctic affect aerosols? So we have local and distant sources of aerosols. So I had mentioned the pollution can get transported up here, but also so can biological aerosols from things like plants. Mineral dust can be transported up here. Biomass burning smoke, which can have some vegetative aerosols in it, those can also be transported up to the Arctic. We also have tundra in the Arctic that can contribute to the biological aerosols found in the atmosphere. And then we have the ocean. So once the summertime hits, we have more open water. You have biology in the ocean that are being more productive once you have the sunlight available. And those can produce a lot of aerosols that enter into the atmosphere. So these microbes that are in the ocean not only produce aerosols themselves from gases, so they produce these sulfur gases, they can emit a lot of sulfur into the atmosphere, and those can then form aerosol particles that can act as cloud condensation nuclei. But they also are particles themselves, so they can emit as whole cells into the atmosphere, they can have fragments of their cells that are emitted, or they produce these products of macromolecules or proteins that can then be emitted to the atmosphere and act as ice nucleating particles. These can happen from winds or waves that are hitting the ocean surface and causing these things in the surface waters to become airborne. So my work recently has actually focused a lot on that specific process. And so I'll give some examples of my previous work in the recent years and how that ties into MOSAiC. And so I've been on an icebreaker the last 2 summers going through the Bering and Chukchi Sea. And basically the focus was to evaluate the biological or marine sources of aerosols that could potentially contribute to aerosol cloud interactions in the atmosphere. And we've observed some pretty interesting cases so far. We've seen things like a really persistent phytoplankton bloom in the Bering Strait that was emitting these ice nucleating particles into the waters, being transported hundreds of kilometers away into the Arctic Ocean, and then becoming airborne and potentially affecting clouds there. I've also been on the North Slope of Alaska on a coastal location in Prudhoe Bay. And the purpose of that study was actually to evaluate local industrial emissions in the Arctic because it's the 3rd largest oil field in North America. And so what we unexpectedly saw was that marine and terrestrial aerosols were actually contributing to the ice nucleating particles there. So pollution, not a very good ice nucleating particle. But once we had the water start to open up during the melt season, and also some of the tundra start to open up, that's when we really saw all these different aerosol particles coming into a polluted location and really affecting the ice nucleating particle populations. And so specifically for MOSAiC, both of those things tie in. So we have the ocean, obviously, because we'll be right over it. We'll mostly be in sea ice, but once we have things like leads or melt ponds where we do have direct interaction between the ocean and atmosphere, we really want to look at how those biological processes that are happening there are affecting the aerosol population and then potentially contributing to cloud condensation nuclei or ice nucleating particles. And so one of the questions is, we're going to be really high up in the Arctic, we already are, so are those sources that we see at lower latitudes, are they affecting the aerosol population there? Do we have more local influences versus those long-range sources? And specifically, how does the biology in the ocean affect the aerosol population? But also, there are microbes and algae that live in the sea ice and snow. So are those actually making their way to the surface and being kicked up by wind and affecting aerosol cloud interactions? And so also using all of these observations and putting them into models to better constrain how clouds form in the Arctic.